And thank you. We're very fortunate today to have Bill Miller here to speak on birds. Bill Miller is the Director Emeritus of the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory in Ozaukee County, and he retired in 2019. Bill has had many roles in avian ecology and conservation, including working on migratory sea ducks, aerial insectivores, the development of the MODIS wildlife tracking system in Wisconsin, and stopover ecology of birds. During the spring of 2013, Bill walked 246 miles across the state of Wisconsin from Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River to raise awareness about bird conservation and to raise funds for the Bird Protection Fund of the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin. And today, we're going to learn about avian insectivores, chimney swifts, whippoorwills, common nighthawks, and swallows.
Thank you. So we're going to get started here. We're going to focus on a number of different concepts today. You're at a Rivers and Lakes conference, so we would like you to be able to say that all of these species are very closely associated with rivers and lakes. Well, that's partly true, because we want to talk about the whole group of species of aerial insectivores. Now, what do I mean when I say that? So those are species that capture their insect prey in flight. So they're not like a robin that plucks an earthworm off the surface of the lawn. Swallows and the nightjars, both the whippoorwill and the nighthawk and the chimney swift, they all, even though they're not in closely related avian families, some are even in different avian orders, they all have this one thing in common, that they capture their prey in flight. And the other unfortunate part of the picture is all aerial insectivores across the board, with very few exceptions, are in decline. So we got nothing. There we go. Okay, in the upper left-hand corner, hopefully you know that one. That's the chimney swift. Looks like a bird without a tail. In the upper right-hand corner is great crested flycatcher. That's one of our forest flycatchers. In the center on the top is common nighthawk. Far left, middle row is the northern rough-winged swallow. In the center, the whippoorwill. Far right in that middle row is bank swallow. Far left on the bottom row is barn swallow. Center on the bottom row is purple martin. That's the largest of Wisconsin's 6 species of swallows. And on the far right-hand corner in the bottom row is cliff swallow. So when ecologists have been studying natural communities, they often worked on terrestrial communities like forests or grasslands, or they worked on aquatic communities like lakes and rivers. But in the last 15 years, there's been an outgrowth of a new discipline in ecology that is called aeroecology, that focuses on these species that utilize the airspace for much of their annual cycle. So you can look at swifts worldwide. There are many species of swifts around the world. Some of those species basically hardly ever come to land. The only time they light is when they're nesting. Now, how do we know this? Well, that's one of the fascinating things about ornithology today. We can put electronic tags of many different types on extremely small organisms. Lately, we've even been able to manufacture some that we can put on something as small as a monarch butterfly. So by using MODIS, for example, or some GPS tags, we've actually been able to learn much more about the migratory journeys of birds that travel tremendous distances. So aeroecology is one of those fields that's really growing. And all of the aerial insectivores have this in common. They all function most of the time in flight. So on the left, purple martin and tree swallow on your right, and the diagram you see below is kind of a diagram of the annual cycle and what happens during which months of the year. And I direct your attention to the outer rim of each one of those circular diagrams. There's kind of a gray area that starts in the summer and goes through part of the fall for both of those species. One of the things that we're able to do now is watch the emergence of the roosts, of really, really large roosts in the Great Lakes region using radar. Now, when you watch the nightly weather radar on your TV, you can see about there in the Mississippi Valley, that bright yellow, that's thunderstorms. But those places that look like blue flowers are actually emerging bird migration that the weather radar is able to see, right? And we can see whether with weather radar bird migration on a given night of the spring or fall. But we're also able to see these relations with maybe 100,000 birds in them taking off, and we can see that in real time. So here's a research paper, the long-term persistence and size of these swallow and martin roosts in the Great Lakes. And the fascinating thing here, especially, I direct your attention to that image in the far lower right corner. That's Lake St. Clair in southeastern Michigan. That's an immense roost of swallows and martins taking off at dawn, right? That may have 150,000 birds in it. Now, you know, it's wonderful to be able to say that we still have roosts of birds that have that many birds in them, but the kind of sad news is those roosts were once probably 4 times as large as they are now. So the take-home message of all of this information is all of these species are in decline with few exceptions. So how do we know bird populations are changing? How do we know how big they are? How do we know how abundant any species is? Well, we've been hard at work for 50 years on doing a number of different monitoring programs. The Federal Breeding Bird Survey is one. In each state, we're just nearing the end of the analysis of the 5-year-long Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas, and we just finished our second one a couple of years ago and working on the analysis of all that data now. And how do we know where birds are distributed and how that distribution changes over time? So this is the result of a tremendous amount of people having worked for a quarter of a century. Back in about 2017, when this article was published in the journal Science, it's kind of shocking to a lot of people to see the extent of decline across all of our avifauna. So we can truly say that in the last 50 years, we have lost 3 billion birds in North America. So something like 35 to 40% of our breeding birds have been lost over time. Here's using one of the sources of data that we now currently use a lot. This is from eBird, which is an electronic recording system for all people who are willing to participate and have some expertise in birds. This is Purple Martin's map, and you can see those areas of the map that are brighter and brighter red, that shows a stronger and stronger decline. Those areas in blue, and there isn't very much on this map that's in dark blue, actually shows some increases. So we know that for a lot of the species that we're talking about today, the worst declines are north of us in the Canadian provinces, and especially in the northeastern United States. So Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, really tremendous declines. But some of these declines are expanding and taking out more species. And you can see, if you're familiar with the map of Eastern North America, purple martin seems to be doing more and more poorly in the lower part of the southeastern United States, like Louisiana, Eastern Texas, and to some extent Mississippi. So our knowledge of birds in Wisconsin has really changed and grown over the last 180 years. You know, we started working as naturalists in the 1840s, collecting information about birds, and our tools and our methods have greatly improved. And that kind of is how we've gotten to know something about bird populations and how they've changed. So there's really this growing concern about the declines of all of these aerial insectivores. And as I mentioned, they belong to different avian orders, in some cases, different families. 6 swallow species, including purple martin, the chimney swift, a group of about 5 or 6 forest flycatchers, and both of our nightjars, which include the whippoorwill and the common nighthawk. So in, let's say, 50, 55 years, 160 million aerial insectivores have been lost since about 1970. 2 in 5 barn swallows. I'll talk a little bit more about barn swallow later in this discussion. Barn swallow is the most widespread songbird on planet Earth. It lives in more places on planet Earth than any other species. And to realize that an extremely widespread, really common species is in decline is very worrisome. So 2 in 5 of our barn swallows probably gone in the last 50 years. So I'm going to show you a number of graphics from the Breeding Bird Survey. What these are trend graphs that show how species have changed in number since the program, the Breeding Bird Survey, was started in 1966. Here's common nighthawk. You can see that, you know, the unfortunate thing about a lot of these graphs is that they're going to look like a playground slide and going in the wrong direction. This shows data from the late 60s to the middle 2010s. Populations of common nighthawk have plunged in North America with a cumulative decline of 58% between 1970 and the middle of the 2010s. According to the coalition of all of these organizations that work on this, Partners in Flight, our study, the organization that I work with, in 2018, we did a study just in Milwaukee County alone. We found no nesting pairs on 27 survey routes in the entire county. We did find a few individual birds during migration, but not during the breeding season. And this is a complete change. When I was a boy, now admittedly, that's 70 years ago, but common nighthawks nested on every flat roof in Milwaukee County at that time. And that's just no longer the case. So here's eastern whippoorwill. It's a very similar picture. Data from the 1960s through the middle 2010s. It seems to be somewhat leveling off, at least in some parts of the country. So there are certainly places where you can still hear whippoorwills, but we know that a lot of their population has been lost. So here's an interesting piece of recent work, and this is using some of those tags to find out where whippoorwills in two different breeding areas, one in eastern Canada, Quebec, and one in central Canada in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Those individual birds all go to basically the same wintering area in southern Central America during the winter. You can see that the colors are represented from a relatively small area. So that shows us one thing about where these birds spend the winter. And actually, you could infer from that it's important to protect those wintering areas, because not only are these birds being affected on the breeding grounds, but also on their wintering grounds. So here's the first of what we'd have to call a change map that resulted from the Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas. This is the Breeding Bird Atlas 2, the one that was just completed. Those areas in red are blocks where the species was present only on Atlas 1 back in the 1990s. Those areas that are in, I guess it's on this kind of an image, it looks kind of dark gray or dark blue, depending on how your eyes see color. Those are where the species was found on both Atlas 1 and Atlas 2. And the green squares are where the species was found only on Atlas 2. So depending on how you look at this map, you can see that a lot of the area of Wisconsin seems to be lacking in eastern whippoorwill now. And that is definitely the case. So another study is published in Ornithological Applications. This shows that this species declines as urban land cover increases in a given area, but it increases with moth abundance. So, you know how you've probably heard, and maybe you've said it yourself, you know, this group of birds is good at capturing insects that we don't like mosquitoes. Well, whippoorwills don't spend much of their time on mosquitoes. That'd be like you being hungry at lunch and having a chance to have like a half a pickle versus a big hamburger, right? So eastern whippoorwill really likes the largest moths that it can find. And the diurnal species like purple martins, they don't really focus very much of their attention on mosquitoes either. They're really after dragonflies and much larger organisms. That's what they need. So this research probably really showed that the number of large moths at a site had a positive effect on the abundance of whippoorwills, but only when those kind of edge kind of locations were associated with high moth abundance. So if land cover had been changed and forest cover had been lost and more development had occurred, the whippoorwill population had declined there. So this research on forest night jars is really showing that it may not simply be declines of insects across the board, but declines of certain species of insects, such as these large moths. Felina English, she's a researcher from British Columbia who did this work. She refers to this as changes in abundance of higher trophic level prey, the preferred prey of this species. So that's really what is important to preserve for continuing good populations of the whippoorwill. Here's the chimney swift. Again, it's kind of a sorry picture. This is for the whole of the Eastern Breeding Bird Survey region. which includes everything from the Mississippi River eastern is to the Atlantic Ocean. And here is a new graph that just came out this week that showed, again, similar to that one that I showed you a little while ago about purple martins. Much of eastern North America is in red or orange, showing greater losses for this species. So what's the deal? What's happening with chimney swift? So we've really tried to look at this across a number of different possible causes. We know that chimney swifts live in urban areas, and nowadays they build their nests in chimneys. That's a complete shift from 150 years ago, where chimney swifts built their nests in big old dead fire-killed snags. Well, a lot of those snags are not on the landscape anymore. So during the 20th century, a lot of chimney swifts took to building their nests in chimneys in urban or suburban areas. All you have to do is drive around in a relatively new subdivision, and you might notice something is missing: chimneys, because we don't build chimneys on new housing much anymore. Furnaces are vented to the side of the house through a PVC pipe about this big around. You don't really need a chimney anymore. And so a couple of things have happened as the number of chimneys has declined. Additionally, in older housing, you find that many people have capped their chimney. And once you do that, chimney swifts can no longer enter that kind of a location again. Now, chimney swifts have a really fascinating behavior to some extent in spring, but much more commonly in fall. They do these pre-migration roosts, and they'll use a large chimney, sometimes on a school or some kind of commercial building, some cases factories, and really large number of swifts will spend the night in that chimney, sometimes for a week, maybe 2 weeks. They're waiting until their numbers really build to a large number, and then they'll all leave. And this bird goes all the way to Chile and Peru for the winter. So if we have open, large chimneys still remaining on the landscape, and we don't cap them, we can provide temporary habitat for this bird during migration. A few years ago at a conference that we had, 2018, we found a school near the site of the conference. It was in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. I'm not sure you're familiar with that place. It's in Waukesha County, southeast, maybe 30 miles west of Milwaukee. And this was a middle school that was no longer currently operating, and the building had not been raised yet. And its chimney had a roost that numbered over 3,000 birds for a period of almost 3 weeks. So those kinds of, kind of human-built habitat are really important for this species. They tend to be larger in autumn than they do in the spring, but some spring roosts can get to be quite large too. So according to figures from the Breeding Bird Survey, trends over a 15-year period have indicated somewhere between a 20 and 29% decline in the global population of this species. And when we say global population, well, it's really not global. This is Eastern North America, basically, only is where the species is found during the breeding season. So we're talking about this, possibly fewer uncapped chimneys. A high rate of chimney capping is currently occurring, and a diminishing use of natural roosts or nest sites. We still have some roosting birds in big dead snags in northern Wisconsin forests occasionally, but it isn't as common. as it once was. And for this species, as well as all of the others that we're talking about today, the crux really may be declining insect populations. That may be the most serious thing, and yet the most difficult thing to unpack. So I know this is a lot of numbers, probably doesn't make sense to look at it as a whole thing, but I draw your attention to the second from the left most vertical column, the column that says trend, right? This is across all of these bird conservation regions. You can see them named on the left-hand side here. But in that trend column, the fact that most of those values are negative values is really the scariest part about this information. So this is just Chimney Swift, and this is just in recent years. So purple martin is, a really fabulous bird that a lot of people in North America are really enamored of. So you can find people who basically know nothing about birds in general, but they love their purple martins, and they put out colony boxes for them. So the really good purple martin landlords, in some cases, you might say they're saving this species. There's a gentleman who has purple martin colonies in not too far from Wisconsin Rapids. He lives on an area that was former cranberry bogs, and he now has 80 nesting structures for purple martins. So he's, what you might say, providing a source population for the whole region, right? So tremendous number of hours of work gone into him caring for those birds and building up that nesting site that he has there. And he works on that tirelessly from spring till fall. Recent research shows that purple martins do not shift their arrival time to respond to higher temperatures. So this is one of the things we're concerned about in regard to climate change, this kind of disconnect between when birds arrive in the spring and what's happening on the landscape at that time. So, for example, we know that non-aerial insectivores or other insectivorous birds arrive, many of them between late April and late May at this latitude. Many of them spend the winter in the tropics, right? They're completely divorced from any kind of information about what the weather is currently like when they're about to arrive in Wisconsin. And one of the things that's happened with climate change is some insect species are hatching earlier and earlier, not on the timing that those birds are used to. So that certainly seems to be a factor affecting purple martins, but many other insectivorous birds as well. And that difference between when insects emerge and when birds arrive is really a mismatch. And that's one of the most serious consequences of climate change for birds. So we can go a little bit further into this species because it doesn't spend the winter in North America at all. Here's another really elegant piece of research done by a group here studying the interrelationships between the mercury feather content of purple martins during the wintering season. So purple martins overwinter and molt in the Amazon basin. And that region is high in mercury contamination. Raises the possibility that these declines in this species could be linked to mercury exposure. Some populations of purple martins overwinter in the Amazon basin, and that mercury is illegally dumped there from artisanal gold mining and changes in water flow caused by hydroelectric dams. So mercury in the water bioaccumulates and biomagnifies through the food web. Mercury content measured in the feathers of purple martins correlated with lower body mass. Now, you might say, well, so what? The bird's a little lighter in weight, right? Well, for a bird like this, lower body mass means probably poor reproduction that following season. So if these birds pick up a load of mercury during the winter and they return to North America in the spring, if they're still carrying body mass load of mercury, they will probably do more poorly in terms of how their reproductive cycle goes. So this is shows you that conditions 1,000, 2,000 miles south of us really has a tremendous effect on breeding success of a favored Wisconsin bird. Mercury contamination results from the bird's diet. Mosquitoes and other large insects tend to lay their eggs in water, where much of the larval phase also takes place. So when that water has a burden of mercury in it, the toxic substance is passed on to the insects, and those species are affected. So here's purple martin change map from Atlas II. Again, the red blocks, those are areas of the state where purple martin was found during Atlas I only. That's in the 1990s. The gray squares show where the species was found during both Atlas I and Atlas II. And the green blocks, Atlas II only. So if you look at this, kind of take a, like the zoomed out view of the state of Wisconsin, you can see that many counties in Wisconsin no longer have active purple martin colonies at all. So that's, again, another worrisome factor for this species. So here's our smallest swallow, bank swallow, another extremely widespread species. It's found all around the world in temperate regions and has some of these species in wintering areas in the tropics. This is a species that builds burrows in a sandy bank. So one of the significant locations where we have many nesting colonies is in areas where they're doing sand and gravel, right? So you could have a sand and gravel operation that has a big sandy hill that's a temporary situation, and bank swallows return in spring, build their burrows into that sandy hill, and if the sand and gravel operator goes in there with a front end loader and might cause part of that hill of sand to be eaten away, or even if that sandy hill is diminished in size by a sudden torrential thunderstorm, for example, the nesting sites for these species can be lost. Plus, they're still facing the same kinds of challenges that the other species I mentioned, the loss of insects and potential contamination from toxics. So bank swallow, as you can see, our Wisconsin results in the lower right-hand corner and regional results to the left. So bank swallow, here's a slightly different map resulting from Atlas II. You can see that the northern third of the state, numbers of individuals in those counties really seem to have been lost since the first atlas back 20 some years ago, especially the northern counties. Bank swallow population has lost an estimated 89% across the United States since the 1970s. In Canada, it's even worse. The largest decline was a 98% loss during that same time period. We're really at a loss for being able to explain why the situation is so much worse in Canada, but that's bearing out to be true for a lot of these species. It may have something to do with cold spring weather. So for a lot of these species, if they arrive in spring and temperatures are kind of normal, and then the following week, they're just beginning to set up a nesting site, and we have a 4 or 5 day cold snap, maybe even snow, and there's no insects for 4 or 5 days. Well, a lot of these species can't shift their diet to anything else. And if they're without food for 4 or 5 days, they perish. So barn swallow is a species that I mentioned earlier that really is the most widespread songbird, passerine bird on the planet. There's still a lot of them here. We still have abundant barn swallows in Wisconsin, but our population seems to be declining here. And we can't really rest when it comes to thinking about this, because those populations just to the north of us are really undergoing severe decline. So you can see on the Western Hemisphere map there, a lot of area in blue in Central and South America are where these individuals spend the winter. So again, we've done a tremendous amount of work on eliminating some pesticides in the United States. Maybe it would surprise you to learn that in a lot of South American countries that is not the case. And even companies that make pesticides here in the US are allowed to continue to sell them, and they're still used by agriculture in South and Central America. So that's one way that this species picks up toxics. So you can see that across the lower 48 and some of those Canadian provinces, this is a completely different kind of a graphic. As you go from light yellow to dark brown, that shows something about the exposure to conservation challenges for this species. So you can see that much of the central part of North America really has conservation challenges, in some cases from oil and gas production, but in some cases also from agriculture. So there are, kind of like the barn swallow can't win for losing. He's hit from a lot of different directions. So here are barn swallow breeding bird survey graphs from the Eastern Breeding Bird Survey region, again, east of Mississippi River, from Alberta and from Ontario. So really severe declines for this very widespread, once really abundant species. And here shows an annual percent change, right? Right north of us in Ontario, the change is in the between minus 25 to 20% annually. So you can't keep that up for too long without having a serious effect on nesting bird population. So here are this is something that you can actually access yourself. This is all online now. The US Forest Service has put out a book, the Climate Change Bird Atlas. And you can see what we predict will happen, right? depending on the kind of climate change scenario that we're liable to experience 30 to 50 to 70 years from now. And you can see the current modeling for this species for barn swallow in the east is shown on the left. On the right, you can see that kind of creeping away from the coast under one of those different modeling scenarios called Hadley. It's really complicated and not really important that we know what it is for our purposes today. But you can see that this really abundant, common, widespread species is starting to lose not only north of us, but also from the south of us due to climate change. So all the swallows have this in common. Tree swallow is the one that's still doing the best. Recent master's thesis, a young woman by the name of Mercy Harris at the University of Saskatchewan. I'll just read a little bit of what she said in her master's thesis to you. I focus on prey quality as a likely driver of swallows selection for wetlands and consumption of emergent insect taxa, but our knowledge of the characteristics of the high quality aerial insectivore prey is still developing. Though a growing body of research suggests that aquatic prey are valuable for swallows, partly because of their high fatty acid content, other nutrients are also important for aerial insectivores. For example, tree swallows seek out and benefit from high calcium foods during the period when they're egg laying and chick rearing, demonstrating that the definition of prey quality probably varies throughout the annual cycle for this species as well as others. So people are likely to ask me, and frequently do, what kinds of things can be done? Here's barn swallow nesting structure. Probably as you drive around the state of Wisconsin, you've noticed that a lot of our old barns are going out of the landscape. The wooden barns that often had multiple openings on each side, right? And they are being replaced by metal sheathed pole barns. Well, that's possibly one important site that birds nest in that we're gradually losing. So some research is being done to put up barn swallow nesting structures like this, right? That replace the wooden barns that we're familiar with from the whole time we've lived in Wisconsin. You can kind of see a schematic on the right, looking through as if you were looking through the roof if the roof was not on the structure. So there's actually place for 18 cup nests in there. And the next photo I'm going to show you shows that you can not only put up a nest structure like this, but you can provide the basics of the cup and made out of wood, right? So more and more research of this type has been done. We're still a ways away from having this be completely successful, and we're learning more and more about not only what we know, but what we don't know about what a species like this needs. So one of the things that we've found is when you put a nesting structure up like this, you have to put it near habitat where the bird would be likely to find insect prey. Bird like a barn swallow, think of it in relation to a farm, especially like a dairy operation. Won't surprise you to learn that the dairy operation has a lot of insects in the group Diptera. What are Diptera? They're flies of many, many species, right? And so the closer you are to that kind of a location where a group of nesting barn swallows could actually successfully find prey, the more successful a new nest structure like that would be. Can I tell you that these nest structures are like 70% effective? I wish I could. We're not there yet. So there's still a lot to be learned. And if this is something that you're interested in, there are many kinds of locations around the state that could use a small-scale research project providing nesting habitat like this. So barn swallows avoid nesting in locations where insects are not really abundant. That seems to be pretty like a no-brainer of a statement, right? Well, but the research actually really shows that to be the case. So this particular nesting structure next to this open grassy field, that was really pretty effective and provided good results. Barn swallow, you know, this is when I first learned this a decade ago, it's kind of knocked me back on my heels because I'm used to thinking of this as an extremely widespread, abundant species. To learn that already for a decade, it's been on the list of endangered species in 4 Canadian provinces. Now, again, is that the case here in Wisconsin? No, but it's kind of like a should be a waving red flag to us, because if it's happening in provinces less than 500 miles north of us, it's also likely coming here, right? And we should be ready. We should be doing all that we can to provide not only nesting habitat, but taking out of pesticides when it's possible, or at least extremely careful use of pesticides. So that's true for this species as well as all of the others that we've talked about today. So our work shows that barn swallows show this behavioral response to broadcasts of their vocalizations. This is not only true for barn swallows, it's true for purple martins, it's true for chimney swifts. Whenever we put up a new structure and we want to attract nesting birds to it, it's really beneficial if we can play a recording of that bird's vocalization in the spring, in the weeks when the birds arrive. Our purple martin colony in Ozolki County, it works. We played purple martin vocalizations every morning for 12 days before the birds arrived. And every spring we've done the same. Every spring those birds respond. We're learning that we can do this with barn swallows and we can do this with chimney swifts as well. So preserving those aging barns or putting up replacement structures really might be key for working on this species as well. So great-crested flycatcher is one of our forest flycatchers that I mentioned, showed you a photograph of it. I'm basically only showing you the same kind of a graph that I've shown so far with every one of these other species. It's a trend going downward. Another forest flycatcher, least flycatcher, which is a smaller one, really used to be an extremely common bird in the northern half of the state. That's sadly not the case anymore. So all the current research that I've been able to find backs up the information that I was able to share with you today. So climate variability has idiosyncratic impacts on North American aerial insectivores, published in biological conservation in 2021. Regional variability in trajectories of barn swallow populations across Canada are not predicted by breeding performance, published in Avian Conservation and Ecology. So you can find a tremendous array of current research kind of telling you that Bill's not crazy. This is really the truth. For some aerial insectivores, this combination of colder springs, it's really cold snap kind of condition that really plays havoc with them. If you talk to people who raise purple martins, they're deadly serious about their purple martins because in some cases they've spent thousands of dollars putting up the most effective kind of housing. So let's say your purple martin colony, your birds are ready to arrive in third week of April, and you've got that first couple of scouts that show up there, and then maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 additional birds, and then all of a sudden you get faced with cold snap, like we're experiencing a lot these days. Late spring snows and stays cold for 4 or 5 days, and where are those purple martins supposed to get aerial insects then? Well, the purple martin monitors, landlords, they haven't given up, right? They've searched for multiple ways. They now put up basically a specialized feeding station for their purple martins with mealworms. And in some cases, they actually feed them soft-boiled eggs that they cook and they throw into the air. And the purple martins catch those bits of partially cooked egg and consume it. And sometimes that helps them get over that 4 or 5 day cold snap. But we have no similar way of doing that for all of the other species that I've mentioned to you today. So purple martin landlords are kind of showing us they're not ready to give up. They're going to figure this out. And I would say that's the message to the rest of us. So aerial insectivores struggle to keep pace with earlier pulses of nutritious aquatic food. So all of the discussions you've heard about wetland ecology this week really feeds into this exactly correctly. So not all those aquatic insects, as the quote here, as it says, they're all not created equal. And we know that some aquatic insects are nutritionally superior for birds. So providing them and providing healthy habitats for them is really critical for getting these kinds of species to continue. So here's yet another article about the interacting effects of cold snaps, rain, and agriculture on the fledgling success of a declining aerial insectivore. So this group of researchers observed that a significant reduction in the availability of insect prey occurred when maximum daily temperatures fell below 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that's not very cold, right? But just that loss of temperature for a very short time could really have an effect on aquatic insects that these species use. The relationship between pesticide use and all of these species is very well documented going back many, many decades. And then you could see that article that I snipped a little piece from The Guardian there. Pesticide use around the world has doubled since the year 1990. That's really gives those of us who've been working on environmental issues for half a century that kind of gives us pause because despite the fact that many people have spent their entire careers working on this issue, we're really far away from the kind of results that we need to get. So we see that insecticide used for soybeans, often what occurs is a phenomenon called drift. When those kinds of insecticides are sprayed on a field, well, it certainly doesn't only affect the field that was targeted for spraying, because just a windy day can cause that insecticide to travel to other nearby locations. So many of the species that I discussed with you today here have either threatened or endangered status in Canada. You can look at this set of documents. It's all available online. Due to population declines across the northern half of North America, barn swallow is listed as threatened in Ontario and threatened across Canada. There does not appear, however, to be a change in productivity during the breeding season for a lot of these species. So what that tells us is a lot of the most damaging effects on these species populations may be occurring when the birds are on the wintering grounds. In some cases, a whole continent away from us, right? So doing effective conservation doesn't only mean doing it here in our local area, but it really means doing it across the hemisphere as a whole. If you're interested in this topic and you really want to learn more, one fairly active group that I can recommend is the Midwest Aerial Insectivore discussion group on Facebook. We post a lot of information weekly there. It's easy to find. Just go to Midwest Aerial Insectivore discussion group when you get to Facebook, and you can certainly join it. We now currently have 238 members across the Midwest, and we're always looking for more people. If you're interested in learning more about especially these species, bank swallow, barn swallow, or chimney swift, please write to me. There's my email address. And you can also get in touch with Wisconsin Chimney Swift Working Group, which is a statewide advocacy organization, also working just on that species alone. And I've got a few minutes, so hopefully might have a question or two. Try to answer.
I got one here from the online folks. Thanks to our Zoom folks for tuning in. Are the greatest declines 1970 to 1995 due to the insecticide use and subsequent reduction since the mid-90s? I'm not sure we've had a reduction.
Right. So that's
why the staggering drop between 1970 and 1990.
that is something that you know, this is what I would have to refer to as a weasel answer. We're still working on that. We're still trying to understand that. So the picture with insecticides has really changed. You know, some of the worst chemicals that we used in the 1950s are no longer on the landscape, but they've been replaced with, in some cases, newer. The chemical manufacturer would tell you that they're better, right? They're better at killing a lot of things. So, you know, I'm not a person who's going to tell you never to use any insecticide or pesticide. There are obviously cases where that's the only thing that you can do, but Americans really overdo it with their pesticide use. I can say that.
One more question, please.
Well, you know, you have to kind of take a step back from this, because this is something that I can suggest to you has been the topic of probably 200 committee meetings, right? How are we going to get this across to people? In a lot of cases, people have kind of unnatural fears of something ending up in the chimney, right? I have a colleague who worked for the biggest humane society in the state, and he could tell you horror stories of people freaking out because a wood duck ended up in their chimney, right? Now, Chimney Swift's a bird about this long, weighs less than an ounce, right? Even if you have a nesting pair and 4 young in a nest, right? And eventually, sometime later in the fall, long after those birds have left and gone to Peru, rains inside the chimney will wash that nest down. The nest is just made of twigs glued together with the bird's saliva. So here's my question, and we don't want to do this in a flip way, right? We want to be serious, but really ask someone, a homeowner, what is the reason that you would be against having a tiny group of birds in a nest no bigger than this inside the wall of your chimney? You'd be very unusual if you could even hear them at all, even during the height of the breeding season. They come in, they go out, right? A bunch of times during the day. They don't cause any damage. There's no threat of like a fire hazard or anything like that. And I can tell you this now, we're communicating with all of the contractors across the state who do basically chimney sweeping, right? They're not allowed from coming in and removing an active nest during the breeding season because those birds are federally protected, right? You can't take them out. You could take the nest out after the birds are done nesting. But what I would ask you is to really think about if you do nothing, right? You just leave your chimney open, the birds come and nest or they don't. You're not really going to notice any difference, right? They're not going to affect you in any negative way whatsoever. And so that's really the question that I think needs to be asked. Anybody else?
I'm afraid we're going to leave it there. You can certainly work with Bill one-on-one if you have questions. Thank you for providing your contact information. Please help me give Bill a